is currently one of the leading Russian proponents of the genocidal war in Ukraine. If you do not want to endorse terrorists, vote no to Mr. Schresser. This is Augustin Conde, conservative Spaniard from Toledo, who also continued to always volunteer to go to Azerbaijan and observe elections. Many of the countries here have a pretty bad human rights record. Let those without sin throw the first stone. I love that. Basically, this was an Irish MP, Terry Layton, who said everyone's bad. Why don't we have a good time? Mr. Aravot, who also wrote a report, which was a trap. The idea was people should vote for his report and reject the Stresser report, and he declared there was no problem. Said that I have been promised by the Azerbaijani government that all individuals will be released quickly. As we know, the rejection of the Stresser report led to an immediate wave of arrests, including of Anna Mammadli, later arrested in 2013 and sentenced in 2014, who this institution gave the Václav Havel Prize, and who was an advisor of Mr. Schresser, who was arrested in 2013. And then we had French conservatives who said we shouldn't draw too black a picture of the country, do not stigmatize it and think about its geopolitical situation. Or Thierry Mariani, also a French politician with Sarkozy, then advisor of Prime Minister Fillon, and today with Le Pen, who said, oh, the rapporteur could not get a visa. How sad. But I will vote for the high-quality report of Mr. Aravot. Now, one of the most interesting statements came from Mike Hancock, a British liberal, who also spent a lot of time in Azerbaijan every election year. Sadly, he couldn't explain this to us because he is no longer alive. But he said, if we're not careful, if we vote for the Stresser report, we are setting an undesirable precedent. Will all countries be subjected to the same scrutiny? I hope we do not, because then we cannot stop here. The report will be duplicated, time after time. And that was the point. By voting against the Stresser report, the idea that there was a definition of political prisoners developed by judges, applied already in 2001, supported by the Committee of Ministers, voted again in October 2012, that this definition of political prisoners could be applied by PACE to establish if there were systemic problems. And the Stresser report explains it very well. It says, yes, we have a court of human rights across the road. But if there's a systemic problem, we cannot wait for people to be years in prison and in the end, of course, they are released. That is already repression if it happens regularly. And that's why the Stresser report was so important, because it said in this case, we need a political serious assessment, we have a definition, and Mr. Stresser established that there was a systemic problem in Azerbaijan, and 125 people said there wasn't. This was a failure of the whole institution, because by then the real cover diplomacy went into turbocharge. Suddenly, almost all the factions, almost all the institutions were changing their tone. And I have a quote here, an internal document from a visit by the Secretary General at that time, Torbjörn Jagland, who visited Azerbaijan on the 24th of June at 8:45 in the morning. This was just after Anna Mammadli was sentenced. Somebody who'd worked for the Council of Europe and for Mr. Stresser, and he was sentenced to 5 years in jail. Just after that, Torbjörn Jagland visits and says, first sentence of this Council of Europe internal paper, the Secretary General remarked that this has been a good start to Azerbaijan's chairmanship. Mammadli's case is not mentioned. On the case of another political prisoner, he just said that, of course, I quote, the judgment in respect to Ilgar Mammadov is not yet final. Well, everybody knew this was political too, but the Secretary General said he can't intervene yet. And then he said, of course, the definition of political prisoners should not be left exclusively to PACE. So, what we had here was an institutional failure across the board. Secretary General, PACE, Committee of Ministers didn't react. And of course, the man who made his whole career defending Azerbaijan. From the start, he couldn't get there often enough. He went to every election observation mission. He wanted to be the rapporteur from the moment he arrived here. He ended up being the rapporteur. Pedro Agramunt was then elected, unopposed, president of this assembly in 2016 and again in 2017 after the Italian prosecutors and our second report on counter diplomacy, the first in 2012, the second in 2016, quoted already how Luca Volonte, who worked closely with Pedro Agramunt was running around with money of another MP, Elkan Süleymanov, who has also been sentenced in first instance by the Milad court, not yet final, but sentenced in first instance, running around distributing and mobilizing support. Now, what do we do with this? Thanks to a few people, and I remember in January 2017, even then it wasn't clear that there would be consequences. Remember, Pedro Aravot was just elected president, and at that time, PACE had a framework to prevent corruption which was worse than that of FIFA. There was no framework. Pedro Aravot determined if there would be any investigation into anything. But there were a few MPs then, and two of them sit here, and I remember your efforts then, to try to mobilize the institution and say, this is really the last chance. If there isn't now an investigation, if there isn't now a reaction, if there isn't now a strengthening of the framework, this institution is dead. And fortunately, it is not dead. Fortunately, a lot of changes took place since. But what now? And I go to the present and the future. The real legacy of the Strasser report is a voting one. In October 2012, it was actually the second time that a definition of political prisoners was approved by this assembly. And his report